Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. So today we're heading into the world of fantasy. Its origins, influences, the whole deal.
The whole shebang.
Exactly. And we're using this really cool YouTube video by Murphy Napier as like our roadmap. They're a booktuber, super knowledgeable about fantasy.
Sounds like a good guide.
Right. Okay, so the big question we're trying to tackle is, what is it about fantasy that just keeps us hooked, like century after century? It's a genre that's been around forever.
Well, yeah, and it's not just a modern thing either. I mean, you think about it, fantasy goes way back to like ancient myths, folklore, even just stories people told each other.
Yeah, like before we were even writing stuff down, people were already into these stories.
Yep.
Crazy.
Totally. I mean, creatures, epic battles, quests, good versus evil, all that stuff was there from the beginning.
He's built into us or something, right?
Maybe. These early stories weren't just like entertainment. They were how people tried to figure out the world, life, death, good, bad, heavy stuff.
Yeah, totally. And it's so interesting how many of those themes are still huge in fantasy today. Like, look at the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's one of the oldest stories we have.
Super old.
But it's got a hero fighting monsters, looking for immortality. He even has to deal with, like, the fact that humans can't live forever.
Whoa. Heavy stuff for way back then.
Right. But it's still relevant today. Like, those ideas still hit home even thousands of years later. It's mind-blowing.
No kidding. And it's not just Gilgamesh either. You've got Greek myths like Perseus, Hercules, think about Beowulf, the whole King Arthur legend, even Journey to the West from China.
Whoa, yeah. Spanning the globe.
Exactly. Different cultures, different times, but all exploring similar ideas through these fantastical stories. It's wild.
So, like, are we just hardwired for this fantasy stuff? Is it escape? Is it trying to figure out, like, right and wrong? I don't know, but it makes you think.
Deep questions,
Very.
for sure. And here's the thing. Even when fantasy wasn't, like, considered serious literature, you still see these fantastical elements popping up in really famous works.
Wait, you're talking about Shakespeare, right? Even he was into this stuff.
Big time. Renaissance dude, but he wasn't afraid to throw in magic, witches, ghosts, fairies, the whole works.
No way. Like, in what plays?
Oh, tons of them. Macbeth with the witches, Hamlet, all those ghosts.
Yeah.
And A Midsummer Night's Dream is just packed with fairies.
So Shakespeare was basically a fantasy fan before fantasy was cool.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
He definitely wasn't afraid to push those boundaries and include elements of the fantastical. I mean, he was a master storyteller, and he knew that those elements could add so much depth and intrigue.
So maybe Shakespeare kind of opened the door for other writers to be more open about using fantasy.
I think so. He definitely made it more acceptable, gave it some legitimacy. And then, boom, you have the rise of Gothic literature in the 1700s, all about atmosphere, mystery, and the supernatural.
Yeah, that's a whole vibe.
Totally. And you can't talk about Gothic lit without talking about Horace Walpole. His novel, The Castle of Otranto. It's like the blueprint for Gothic fiction.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. It's about, who was it again?
Okay, so imagine this. A crumbling castle, prophecies, family curses, and all sorts of spooky stuff going down. Walpole even said Shakespeare was a big influence.
That makes sense with all the drama and the supernatural stuff.
Right. And here's the thing. The Castle of Otranto gave us so many of the tropes we still see in fantasy and horror today. Haunted houses, secret passages, family secrets. It's all there.
It's like those themes just like tap into something deep inside us. Why are we so obsessed with haunted houses and curses?
Right. I mean, think about it. This was all happening alongside the rise of fairy tales in the 1800s. The Brothers Grimm were busy collecting and publishing all those oral tales, and they totally blew up.
Yeah, the Grimm fairy tales are iconic. Dark and sometimes a little messed up, but totally captivating.
Exactly, and they really stuck with us. It's fascinating to see how all these different movements, even though they were kind of separate, were all exploring these themes of the supernatural and the unexplainable.
It was like a cultural obsession.
Totally. And don't forget Hans Christian Andersen, The Nutcracker, The Little Mermaid. Those stories are like classics.
I love those.
They're timeless. Andersen really showed that fairy tales weren't just for kids. They could have these deep themes and still resonate with adults. But here's something really cool. Around this time, you start to see fairy tales getting longer.
Like full-on novels.
Yes. Phantasmium by Sarah Coleridge came out in 1837, one of the first full-length fairy tale novels.
Yeah.
Super groundbreaking.
Wow, I had no idea. That's a huge step for fantasy.
Totally. It showed that these fantastical stories could be so much more than just short tales. They could have complex plots and characters that you could really connect with. And this, get this, leads to the first fantasy novel explicitly written for adults.
Wait, seriously, who wrote that?
George MacDonald.
Yeah.
His 1858 novel, Phantastes. It's about a young guy who goes into a magical world, like portal fantasy.
I get it. That's a classic trope.
Right. And MacDonald's quote about not writing for children but for the childlike, that's the heart of it. No matter your age, there's that part of you that loves fantasy, that wants to believe in magic and adventure.
It's so true. It's like no matter how old you get, you never really lose that sense of wonder.
Exactly. And you see this shift in the way people thought about fantasy throughout the 1800s. It was no longer just for kids. It was becoming a genre that could handle mature themes and grab adult readers.
Yeah, it was evolving.
For sure. And that evolution becomes super clear with William Morris. His novel, The House of the Wolfings from 1889. Let me tell you, that book is world building at its finest.
Oh, what makes it so special?
This guy, he created a whole new world, not connected to ours at all. He made up its history, myths, culture, even a language. Like, mind blown. He set the stage for all the immersive world building we see in fantasy today.
Whoa. So he was kind of like a proto-Tolkien.
Absolutely. Tolkien was hugely influenced by Morris. But here's a fun fact. The word fantasy itself didn't really become common until the 1940s.
What? So what did they call it before that?
It was all kind of lumped together, weird fiction, speculative fiction. But then these magazines popped up. Magazine of fantasy and science fiction, weird tales. And suddenly fantasy became a thing.
Wow. So these magazines were like the tastemakers of the day.
Totally. And they featured authors like H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard. They were all pushing the boundaries of what fantasy could be.
It's amazing how much influence those magazines had on the genre.
Huge influence. They helped solidify fantasy as its own thing. And then as we move into the mid-20th century, things get really interesting. You start seeing fantasy blend with other genres like science fiction and historical fiction.
Oh yeah, that's something you see a lot in modern fantasy, right? Those lines get super blurry.
Exactly. And one of the early examples of this blending is Anne McCaffrey's The Dragon Riders of Pern, which came out in 1967. She had dragons that could communicate with humans. It was this awesome mix of fantasy and science fiction that just blew people's minds.
Dragons and humans talking? That's pretty wild.
Right. And then in 1968, Ursula K. Le Guin comes along with A Wizard of Earthsea. That book became a cornerstone of modern fantasy, and it popularized the whole magical school trope, which we see everywhere now.
Ah, so she was the OG of magical schools. Love that book.
Le Guin was a master. Beautiful writing, complex themes, and her magic system wasn't based on European traditions, which was super refreshing at the time.
Yeah.
And we can't forget Octavia Butler. Her 1979 novel, Kindred, is a time travel story that explores slavery in America.
Whoa, that sounds intense.
It is. It's powerful, thought-provoking, and it shows how fantasy can be used to talk about serious social issues.
So we're basically at the cusp of modern fantasy now, right? About to get into the era of Tolkien, Martin, Rowling.
Exactly. We've come a long way from ancient myths to dragons talking to humans, and it's only going to get more interesting from here.
I can't wait. But before we jump into all that, let's take a breather and just appreciate the incredible journey fantasy has taken.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. From those early stories around the fire to massive immersive worlds, it's amazing to see how much the genre has evolved.
It's a testament to the power of imagination, and the fact that we're still so drawn to these stories, even after all these centuries, tells you something about how deep that need for fantasy runs in us.
It's a part of who we are, I think.
Absolutely. It really is amazing to see how fantasy just keeps evolving, finding new ways to connect with us.
Totally. It's like it's constantly reinventing itself, but always staying true to that core sense of wonder and imagination.
Exactly. And speaking of wonder and imagination, we can't talk about modern fantasy without talking about, like, the giant in the room.
Oh, you mean Tolkien?
Yeah, J.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. He basically reshaped the entire landscape of fantasy.
No question about it. Those books, they were game changers. I mean, The Hobbit came out in 1937, and then the Lord of the Rings trilogy between 1954 and 1955.
And they're still massively popular today. Like, what was it about Tolkien's work that just resonated so deeply with people?
I think it's the depth,
Right.
He didn't just write stories, he created entire worlds. Middle-earth felt real, like a place you could actually visit.
It's true. The languages, the history, the mythology, it was all so intricate, so detailed.
Right. He had languages for the elves, the dwarves. The backstory of Middle-earth went back thousands of years. It was like stepping into another reality.
And it wasn't just the world building, right? His themes were really powerful too. Good versus evil, the dangers of power, the importance of hope.
Absolutely. And those themes really hit home. Especially after World War II. The world had seen so much darkness, so much suffering. People were looking for hope, for something to believe in.
And Tolkien gave them that, in a way. The sense that even in the darkest times, there's still good in the world, still a chance for things to get better.
Yeah, exactly. It was like this escape, but also this affirmation that hope is real, even when things seem impossible.
He even talked about fantasy as a kind of escape, right? A way to find solace when the real world gets too much.
He did. But his work was so much more than just escapism. It was about human nature, about about the struggles we all face, about finding the strength to keep going, even when things are tough.
Deep stuff. And Tolkien wasn't alone in shaping fantasy during this time. You had C.S. Lewis with the Chronicles of Narnia.
Oh yeah, completely different vibe, but just as impactful. The Narnia books, they had this Christian allegory woven throughout, this focus on faith and imagination.
And they appealed to both kids and adults, right? They had that magical quality that just transcends age.
Totally. Like Tolkien, Lewis was dealing with these big themes of good versus evil, sacrifice, redemption, but he did it in a way that was really accessible, especially for younger readers.
It's fascinating to see how both Tolkien and Lewis, even though they came at fantasy from different angles, both helped solidify it as a genre that could tackle these big, meaningful questions.
Absolutely. They showed that fantasy wasn't just about escapism or lighthearted fun. It could be deeply philosophical, deeply spiritual.
And they paved the way for a whole new generation of fantasy writers who would continue to push those boundaries.
Yeah, like George R.R. Martin. He came along in the late 20th century and just blew everyone's minds with A Song of Ice and Fire.
Oh yeah, Game of Thrones. That series totally redefined fantasies for a lot of people. It's not your typical heroes and villains kind of story.
Right. It's what they call grimdark fantasy. Super gritty, morally ambiguous, with characters that are complex and flawed. You never know who to root for.
And that's what makes it so compelling. It feels real, even though it's set in this fantastical world.
Exactly. Martin was willing to subvert all those classic fantasy tropes, and people loved it. It was like a breath of fresh air.
And then you have the whole TV adaptation, Game of Thrones, which was a massive hit.
Oh yeah, that show took the world by storm. It brought fantasy to a whole new audience and showed that it could be just as gripping and intense as any historical drama or thriller.
Totally. It was like fantasy finally got its moment in the spotlight.
Exactly. And while Martin was shaking things up in adult fantasy, you had another author revolutionizing young adult fantasy, J.K. Rowling.
Ah, the queen of magical schools. Harry Potter was a phenomenon.
It was magical, no pun intended. Rowling created this world that was both familiar and extraordinary, where magic existed alongside the everyday.
And kids went crazy for it. I mean, adults too, but it really captured the imaginations of a whole generation.
For sure. It was like a cultural reset for fantasy. Suddenly, everyone was talking about Hogwarts, Quidditch, spells. It was everywhere.
Movies, theme parks, video games. Harry Potter became a global empire.
It's amazing. And it showed that fantasy, especially young adult fantasy, had this incredible power to connect with people on a massive scale.
And it wasn't just Harry Potter. You had Twilight, too, which was huge.
Oh, yeah. Vampires and teenage romance. Maybe not your typical fantasy, but it still had that supernatural element that drew people in.
And it explored themes of love, loss, identity, things that teenagers are already grappling with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was fantasy tailored to a specific audience, and it worked. It was a massive success.
So you have both Harry Potter and Twilight proving that young adult fantasy was a force to be reckoned with.
For sure. And it's a subgenre that's still going strong today. There are so many amazing YA fantasy books out there exploring all sorts of themes and ideas.
It's awesome to see how much fantasy has diversified and expanded in recent decades. There's truly something for everyone.
Totally. And it's not just about escapism anymore. It's about exploring the human condition, grappling with moral dilemmas, challenging social norms. It's become this incredibly versatile genre.
It's come a long way, that's for sure. And it all goes back to those ancient myths and stories that we talked about earlier.
It's a testament to the power of storytelling. And the fact that we're still so captivated by these stories, even after all these centuries, tells you something about how deeply they resonate with us.
Absolutely. So we've journeyed through centuries of fantasy, from ancient myths to modern bestsellers. But what does this all mean for us as readers, as fans of the genre?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that each of us has to answer for ourselves. But I do believe that fantasy offers us something truly special.
Like what?
Well, it allows us to explore our hopes, our fears, our dreams in a way that other genres sometimes can't.
It's like a safe space for our imaginations to run wild.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, by immersing ourselves in these fantastical worlds, by experiencing the challenges and triumphs of these characters, maybe we can learn something about ourselves, about the world around us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's bring it back to Murphy Napier, the booktuber whose video inspired all this.
Oh yeah. They shared a really personal story about how The Lord of the Rings actually helped them through a really tough time in their life.
It was like their escape, their comfort, their reminder that even when things are bad, there's always hope.
It's a beautiful story, and it speaks to the power that fantasy can have on our lives. It's not just entertainment, it's something deeper, something more meaningful.
And it reminds us that stories, even fictional ones, have the power to touch our hearts, to inspire us, to help us find our way. It's wild, right? Like, a story about hobbits and orcs can actually help someone through a tough time in real life.
It is pretty amazing. It shows how powerful stories can be no matter where they come from. We connect with them, they make us feel less alone.
Totally. And thinking back on everything we've talked about, it seems like fantasy has always been this way, right? Like a reflection of what we're going through, our worries, our hopes.
Oh, for sure. I mean, take those Gothic castles we were talking about earlier. Those weren't just random. People back then were worried about the past, about hidden things, about power crumbling.
Yeah, it's like those anxieties found a way into their stories.
Exactly. And we see the same thing today, right? Climate change, politics, technology changing so fast, it all makes its way into modern fantasy.
It's like we're working through those anxieties, but in a different world with magic and stuff.
Right. Dystopian worlds, post-apocalyptic stories. It's us, but with a fantasy twist.
It's like a way to process it all, maybe even find some release, some hope.
Totally. And it's not just anxieties either.
Yeah.
Fantasy can also reflect what we want to see in the world, right?
Oh, yeah. Like all those stories about underdogs and chosen ones, quests for freedom and equality.
Exactly. We're drawn to those stories because they tap into our desire for a better world, where individuals can make a difference, where hope wins out in the end.
Maybe by reading those stories, by imagining those possibilities, we actually make it a little more likely that those good things will happen in our own world, you know?
That's a thought.
Yeah.
Maybe we plant those seeds of hope in our own minds just by reading fantasy.
It's like by imagining something better, we take a step closer to actually making it happen.
I like that. And fantasy has always had this power to challenge us, to make us think about things differently.
It pushes us beyond our comfort zones, makes us question our assumptions.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of fantasy, what's the one thing you'd want our listeners to take away from all of this?
Ooh, good question.
For me, it's this. Fantasy is more than just an escape. It's a way to connect with our deepest selves, to explore big ideas, to find meaning and wonder in a world that can sometimes feel, well, kind of mundane.
Beautifully said. So, to everyone listening, what does fantasy mean to you? What keeps you coming back to these stories of magic and adventure? Think about it. And until next time, keep those imaginations firing, keep exploring those fantastical worlds, and remember, a little bit of magic can go a long way.